Most people read this biblical passage and miss its revolutionary power. They think it means God will validate whatever rules we create on earth. But Joel Goldsmith discovered something far more profound that changes everything about how consciousness creates reality. This ancient wisdom holds the master key to healing, manifestation, and spiritual freedom. What you bind in consciousness becomes your lived experience, not through divine approval or external permission, but through the immutable law of consciousness itself. Your inner convictions, your accepted beliefs, your mental agreements create the conditions you experience. This is not metaphor. This is spiritual mechanics. When you bind fear in your thoughts, fear manifests in your world. When you bind limitation as truth, limitation becomes your experience. But here is the transformation secret. When you bind spiritual truth in consciousness, heaven's reality appears on earth. Not someday, not after death. Right now, in this moment, through understanding. Joel Goldsmith spent decades proving this principle through thousands of documented healings. He watched terminal illnesses dissolve. He witnessed financial impossibilities transform overnight, not through begging God or positive thinking alone, but through recognizing what consciousness was binding as real and deliberately unbinding it. The word bind means to tie, to make secure, to establish as law. Every time you accept a condition as permanent, you bind it. Every diagnosis you agree with internally, every limitation you call real, every fear you treat as fact becomes bound in your experience. Your consciousness is the binding agent, and you have been using it unconsciously your entire life. Here is what changes everything. You possess the same power to unbind. The moment you withdraw your inner agreement from any condition, you begin dissolving its hold on your reality. This is not denial. This is spiritual authority recognizing that consciousness, not matter, determines experience. Goldsmith taught that heaven is not a location, but a state of consciousness where spiritual truth reigns supreme. When you bind spiritual truth in your awareness, that heavenly state materializes as earthly demonstration. The key word is bind, meaning to establish firmly, to make it your operating conviction, your foundational reality. Most people try to change their circumstances while keeping their consciousness unchanged. They want the outer picture to shift while binding the same fears, doubts, and limitations internally. This cannot work. The outer world is effect, never cause. What you establish in consciousness must appear in experience because consciousness is the only creative power. When you truly bind the truth that God is the only power, lack loses its authority over you. When you bind the reality that spirit governs your body, disease loses its claim. When you bind your identity as spiritual consciousness rather than vulnerable flesh, the entire game changes. This is not philosophy. This is activation. The transformation begins when you stop giving power to appearances and start binding spiritual truth as your only reality. Not as affirmation you hope becomes true, but as recognition of what is already eternally true in the kingdom of consciousness. You are not creating truth. You are binding yourself to truth that already exists in its fullness. Goldsmith emphasized that this binding must happen in the secret place of consciousness, not through loud declarations or forced belief. It is the quiet, deep inner knowing that shifts everything. When you silently establish spiritual truth as your foundation, your entire experience reorganizes around that new center of gravity without effort or strain. This is why Jesus taught this principle. He knew that human beings possess the authority to bind and loose, to establish and release, through consciousness alone. Your agreement or disagreement with conditions determines their power over you. What you bind through acceptance becomes your law. What you loose through spiritual understanding loses all authority. A woman came to Goldsmith with a diagnosis the doctors called terminal. 6 months maximum. She had already accepted death, made peace with it, bound it as inevitable truth. Goldsmith did not argue with the diagnosis. He worked with her consciousness. For 3 weeks, they met daily, not to treat her body, but to unbind the conviction of death and bind the truth of eternal life. She later described the shift as sudden, yet gradual. One morning she realized she no longer believed in the diagnosis. Not through positive thinking, but through genuine understanding that consciousness, not matter, determined her experience. She had unbound death and bound life. Within 2 months, every test showed complete remission. The doctors called it spontaneous. Goldsmith called it demonstration. The woman lived another 23 years, not in fear of recurrence, but in the freedom of understanding. She had learned the secret. What you bind in consciousness must manifest in experience. She kept binding spiritual truth, and her body continued reflecting that inner binding. This is not exceptional. This is the law operating as designed. Another case involved a businessman facing bankruptcy. Everything on paper confirmed his failure. Debts exceeded assets 3-to-1. Legal deadlines approached. He came to Goldsmith desperate for a miracle. Instead, Goldsmith taught him about binding and loosing. The man needed to unbind his acceptance of failure and bind the truth of infinite spiritual supply. For 2 weeks, the man practiced, not denying his circumstances, but refusing to bind them as ultimate reality. He unbound his agreement with lack. He bound his consciousness to the truth that spirit's abundance knows no limitation. He stopped empowering the appearance and started establishing spiritual truth as his operating system. Nothing changed externally for 13 days. On the 14th day, 3 unexpected opportunities arrived within hours. A forgotten investment matured. A business contact offered partnership. A legal technicality eliminated half the debt. Within 90 days, complete financial restoration. The man had learned that binding truth in consciousness must produce corresponding earthly demonstration. He continued this practice and built lasting prosperity. Goldsmith emphasized that this is not magic or manipulation. This is spiritual law operating with precision. When you bind truth in consciousness, you align with the infinite creative power that governs all existence. When you bind falsehood, limitation, or fear, you cut yourself off from that power and experience the darkness of separated consciousness. The profound part is that you are always binding something. Your consciousness never stops creating your experience based on what you accept as real. Most people unconsciously bind negativity, limitation, and fear simply through habit and social conditioning. They wonder why life feels hard. They have bound hardness as reality through unconscious agreement. The transformation happens when you become conscious of this binding power and use it deliberately. You begin examining what you have bound as true. You start questioning whether your accepted beliefs serve your highest good. You practice unbinding old patterns and binding spiritual truth instead. This is the work. This is the path. This is how heaven manifests on earth. Here is what Joel Goldsmith proved repeatedly. The moment you genuinely bind spiritual truth in consciousness, the corresponding earthly demonstration must follow. Not might follow, must follow. Because consciousness is cause, and the material world is effect. Change the cause, and the effect has no choice but to reorganize accordingly. This is immutable spiritual law. You possess this power right now. Every thought you entertain, every belief you accept, every conviction you hold is binding something in your experience. The question is not whether you will bind, but what you will bind. Will you continue unconsciously binding limitation? Or will you consciously bind the truth that sets you free? Start today with one area of concern. Identify what you have bound as real. Disease, lack, conflict. Then consciously unbind your agreement with that condition. Establish spiritual truth instead. Bind the reality that God is the only power, that spirit governs all, that consciousness creates experience. Practice this daily. Watch what happens. If these transformation principles resonate with your spirit, like this video to help others discover Joel Goldsmith's wisdom. Subscribe for more consciousness teachings that actually work, and comment which limiting belief you are ready to unbind right now. Beyond the main binding practice, Goldsmith taught complementary techniques that accelerate transformation. The first is what he called the practice of resting in God. When you rest in spiritual consciousness, you stop trying to force demonstrations and allow the bound truth to naturally manifest. Force indicates you have not truly bound the truth, but are still struggling with doubt. True binding produces rest. When you genuinely establish spiritual truth in consciousness, effort ceases. You know the demonstration must appear because you have aligned with the creative power itself. This rest is not passivity. It is confident expectation based on understanding spiritual law. You have done the inner work of binding truth. Now you rest in that binding and let it unfold. Practice this. After binding spiritual truth about any situation, deliberately rest. Stop mentally working the problem. Stop checking for results. Simply rest in your inner knowing that consciousness creates experience and you have established the right cause. This rest itself becomes evidence that your binding was genuine. Doubt cannot rest. Understanding can do nothing but rest. The second complementary technique is what Goldsmith called watching. You watch your thoughts like a guardian, immediately catching any attempt to unbind spiritual truth and rebind limitation. The mind has been conditioned for decades to bind negativity. It will try to return to old patterns. Your job is vigilant watching without strain or tension. When fear thoughts arise suggesting the old condition still has power, you gently unbind them. When doubt whispers that nothing is changing, you recognize this as an attempt to rebind limitation. You do not fight these thoughts. You simply refuse them your agreement. You have bound spiritual truth, and you maintain that binding through gentle, persistent watching. This watching becomes easier with practice. Initially, you may need to correct your thoughts dozens of times daily. Within weeks, the corrections decrease. Your consciousness begins naturally maintaining the binding of truth without constant effort. This is the formation of spiritual consciousness, where truth becomes your automatic operating system rather than limitation. The third technique Goldsmith emphasized is living from the invisible. Most people live from the visible, letting appearances dictate their inner state. When appearances seem negative, they bind negativity. When appearances seem positive, they bind positivity. This keeps them trapped in the material realm where circumstances control consciousness instead of consciousness controlling circumstances. Living from the invisible means maintaining your binding of spiritual truth regardless of what the material world currently shows. You understand that the visible is always past tense, the result of previous consciousness. Your current binding determines future visible demonstrations. Therefore, you refuse to let current appearances unbind the truth you have established within. This is advanced practice but essential for consistent demonstration. When the bank account looks empty, you continue binding abundance truth. When the body shows symptoms, you continue binding spiritual wholeness. When relationships seem broken, you continue binding divine harmony. You live from the invisible truth you have bound, and the visible must eventually conform because consciousness is senior to matter. The fourth complementary practice is what Goldsmith called the practice of immediacy. Many people bind truth but project its demonstration into the future. They think, this will work eventually, someday I will be healed, in time my supply will come. This future projection actually unbinds the truth by agreeing that limitation has power right now. True binding recognizes that spiritual reality exists in its fullness immediately, not tomorrow, not after you prove yourself worthy. Right now, in this present moment, the truth you bind is already complete in consciousness. Your work is recognizing present perfection, not creating future improvement. When you bind health, you bind it as now. When you bind supply, you bind it as already established. This immediacy collapses time in your experience. Demonstrations that might take months through future-focused consciousness often appear within days or weeks through immediate recognition. You are not waiting for God to act. You are recognizing that God has already established all perfection in spiritual consciousness. Your binding makes you aware of what already is. This changes everything about how quickly transformation occurs. Every person attempting this work encounters specific challenges. The first and most common is the weight of physical evidence. When you bind health but the body still shows symptoms, doubt crashes in like a wave. The symptoms seem more real than your inner binding. This is where most people abandon the practice and rebind the material condition as ultimate reality. Goldsmith taught that appearances have no power except what you give them through agreement. Yes, the symptoms appear. Yes, the lack seems evident. Yes, the problem looks unchanged. But these are effects of past consciousness. Your new binding has not yet had time to manifest visibly. The challenge is maintaining your binding despite contrary evidence, knowing that consciousness always wins over matter eventually. The solution is understanding lag time. Physical reality does not instantly reorganize the moment you bind new truth. There is a period where the old manifestation persists while the new binding works invisibly. This lag time tests your conviction. If you rebind the limitation because nothing seems to change quickly, you abort the demonstration. Persistence through the lag time is essential for success. The second major challenge is social pressure. When you tell people you are binding spiritual truth for healing or supply, many respond with skepticism or concern. They mean well, but their doubt can shake your conviction if you allow it. They insist you face reality, accept the facts, be reasonable. What they call reality is actually limited perception treating effect as cause. Goldsmith experienced this constantly. Medical professionals questioned his methods. Religious authorities challenged his interpretations. Even students sometimes doubted. His response was consistent. I am not asking you to believe my words. I am asking you to test the principle in your own consciousness. Bind truth and watch what happens. Let demonstration be your evidence, not human opinion. The practical solution is practicing in silence initially. Do not announce your binding work to skeptical audiences. Establish your inner conviction first. Let some demonstrations occur. Once you have personal proof that binding consciousness creates experience, others' opinions lose their power to disturb you. You know what you know through direct experience. That knowing cannot be shaken by those who have never tested the principle. The third challenge is inconsistency. You bind truth powerfully in the morning, then unbind it through worry by afternoon. You establish spiritual reality during meditation, then re-establish material limitation through fear-based conversations. This binding and unbinding creates confused consciousness that produces mixed, unreliable demonstrations. You get partial results that neither fully succeed nor completely fail. Goldsmith compared this to trying to go north and south simultaneously. You end up nowhere. Consistent binding produces consistent demonstration. Inconsistent binding produces chaos. The challenge is catching yourself in the act of unbinding and immediately re-establishing truth. This requires the watching practice mentioned earlier, but applied specifically to consistency of consciousness throughout the day. The solution is creating consciousness checkpoints. Several times daily, pause and examine what you currently have bound as real. If you discover you have drifted back into binding limitation, immediately unbind it and re-establish truth. Do this without self-criticism. Simply correct course the moment you notice drift. Over weeks, these checkpoints train your consciousness to maintain consistent binding naturally without constant monitoring. The fourth challenge is confusing binding with affirmation. Many people repeat positive statements without changing their actual binding. They say God is my supply while still binding lack as reality in their consciousness. They affirm perfect health while still binding the diagnosis as ultimate truth. The words say one thing, the consciousness binds another. Results match the binding, not the words. True binding is deeper than verbal affirmation. It is the silent establishment of truth as your foundational conviction, your operating reality, your unshakable knowing. You can tell when you have genuinely bound truth because effort ceases. You are not trying to convince yourself. You simply know. This knowing produces rest, confidence, and patient expectation rather than anxious hoping. The solution is checking your inner state. When you claim to have bound truth, do you feel peaceful or anxious? Does the thought of checking material conditions disturb you or feel irrelevant? True binding produces detachment from appearances because you know consciousness determines experience. If you feel desperate for visible proof, you have not yet genuinely bound the truth, but are still hoping it might become true. If these challenge-breaking insights are expanding your understanding, like to support this transformative content, subscribe for advanced Joel Goldsmith teachings, and comment which of these 4 challenges you recognize in your own spiritual practice right now. Advanced practice involves binding truth not just in crisis but as permanent consciousness. Goldsmith lived in this state. He did not bind health when sick and then forget it when well. He maintained continuous binding of spiritual truth as his operating system. This produced a life largely free from the common disasters that plague human existence because those disasters could not find binding in his consciousness. This is the difference between emergency binding and consciousness transformation. Most people only practice when problems arise. They bind truth under pressure, get their demonstration, then return to unconscious binding of limitation until the next crisis appears. This keeps them on a roller coaster of demonstration and collapse, victory and defeat, healing and recurrence. The advanced path is making spiritual truth your permanent binding regardless of circumstances. You bind God as only power whether facing challenge or enjoying success. You bind spiritual identity whether sick or healthy, poor or prosperous. This consistent binding eventually elevates your entire experience because your consciousness becomes so established in truth that limitation finds no agreement point, no place to bind itself in your awareness. Goldsmith demonstrated this advanced consciousness in practical daily life. He bound spiritual harmony in all relationships, so conflict rarely arose. When it did, it dissolved quickly because his consciousness gave it no sustaining power. He bound infinite supply as permanent reality, so lack never gained foothold regardless of economic conditions. He bound divine guidance as constant, so decisions flowed with unusual clarity and rightness. This was not perfection in the human sense. Goldsmith faced challenges like everyone. The difference was his response. Where most people immediately bind the challenge as powerful reality requiring intense effort to overcome, Goldsmith immediately unbound its claim to power and rebound spiritual truth. This refusal to give problems binding in consciousness meant they appeared smaller, resolved faster, and taught lessons without creating trauma. The practical application is approaching every situation, pleasant or unpleasant, as an opportunity to practice conscious binding. Your car breaks down. Do you bind mechanical failure as disaster, or unbind that agreement and bind divine order? Someone speaks unkindly. Do you bind offense and hurt, or unbind that reaction and bind forgiveness and peace? Every moment offers the choice of what you will bind as real in your consciousness. Another advanced application involves binding truth for others without their knowledge. Goldsmith discovered that when he bound spiritual truth about another person, that person's experience often shifted even though they knew nothing about his inner work. This seems mysterious until you understand that consciousness is one. What you bind for another in genuine spiritual knowing affects the consciousness you share. This is not manipulation or control. You cannot bind anything in another's consciousness against their will, but you can refuse to bind their limitation as ultimate reality. When someone comes to you sick, you can unbind your agreement with their sickness and bind their spiritual perfection instead. When someone seems trapped in poverty, you can unbind your seeing them that way and bind their connection to infinite supply. This practice requires purity of motive. You are not trying to make people into what you want them to be. You are recognizing what they truly are in spiritual reality and refusing to bind the limited appearance as truth. Often this inner work produces surprising changes in their experience because your consciousness no longer reinforces their limitation. You have withdrawn your agreement from their problem, and that withdrawal removes supporting energy. The highest advanced practice Goldsmith taught is binding heaven on earth as permanent condition, not just healing this sickness or solving that problem, but establishing your consciousness so completely in spiritual truth that your entire experience becomes what he called heaven manifest. Problems still appear, but they lose their power to disturb because they find no binding in consciousness that treats them as ultimate reality. This does not happen through a single decision. It develops through years of consistent practice, binding truth in situation after situation until spiritual consciousness becomes your natural state. You gradually shift from someone who occasionally practices binding truth to someone whose consciousness is bound to truth as permanent reality. The difference produces dramatically different life experiences. People who met Goldsmith late in life reported a quality about him that transcended normal human existence. Peace that circumstances could not shake. Joy independent of external conditions. Wisdom that seemed to flow without effort. This was not personality. This was consciousness so bound to spiritual truth that heaven's reality had become his earthly experience. This is the promise available to anyone willing to practice until binding truth becomes their automatic state. As we approach the completion of this teaching, understand that you now possess knowledge that most people live entire lifetimes without discovering. The principle of binding and loosing is the master key that unlocks every spiritual teaching, every healing testimony, every demonstration of supply or harmony. Everything works through this single principle. Consciousness creates experience based on what it binds as real. You are not powerless. You have never been powerless. You possess the same authority Jesus spoke about when he revealed this principle. What you bind on earth through your consciousness will be bound in heaven, meaning it must manifest in your experience because consciousness and experience are one continuous reality. Matter serves consciousness, never the other way around. The question now is what you will do with this understanding. Will you return to unconscious binding of limitation, fear, and lack? Or will you begin the deliberate practice of unbinding old patterns and binding spiritual truth until it becomes your permanent consciousness? The choice determines whether you live in earth's darkness or heaven's light, and that choice is entirely yours to make. Goldsmith spent his final years emphasizing that this teaching is not about acquiring anything external. It is about recognizing what already exists in spiritual consciousness and binding yourself to that eternal reality rather than temporary material appearances. Heaven is not created by your binding. Heaven already exists as the realm of spiritual truth. Your binding simply makes you aware of it and allows it to become your lived experience. This removes all strain from the practice. You are not trying to manifest something that does not exist. You are recognizing what eternally exists and withdrawing your agreement from the illusion of separation, limitation, and lack. Every time you unbind a false belief and bind spiritual truth, you take one step out of darkness into light. Each step makes the next step easier until walking in light becomes natural. Start where you are with what concerns you most right now. Apply the binding principle to that specific situation. Unbind your agreement with the problem. Bind the spiritual truth that applies to that area. Practice consistently through the lag time until demonstration appears. Let that success build your confidence to apply the principle more broadly until your entire consciousness undergoes transformation from bound limitation to bound freedom. The spiritual journey is not about becoming something you are not. It is about unbinding false identity and binding true identity. You are not material being trying to become spiritual. You are spiritual consciousness that has temporarily bound itself to material identity. Every limitation you experience comes from that false binding. Every freedom you seek already exists in the spiritual identity you have forgotten. Goldsmith's entire ministry aimed at this single realization. You are consciousness, not body. You are spirit, not matter. You are eternal, not temporary. When you bind this truth about yourself, everything changes because you have shifted from identifying with effect to identifying with cause. Effect is powerless. Cause is all-powerful. You have always been cause, but you bound yourself to effect through misunderstanding. This is the ultimate binding work. Binding your identity to spiritual truth rather than material appearance. When you genuinely know yourself as consciousness rather than body, as spirit rather than flesh, as eternal rather than mortal, the entire game changes. Problems that once seemed overwhelming become opportunities to demonstrate spiritual authority. Limitations that once defined you become evidence of old binding ready to be released through new understanding. You now understand what happens when you truly grasp that what you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. You recognize that your consciousness is the binding force creating your experience. You see that every condition in your life exists because you have bound something as real through agreement, attention, or acceptance. And you know that you possess the power to unbind old patterns and bind spiritual truth instead. This is not the end of teaching, but the beginning of practice. Goldsmith proved this principle works through decades of consistent demonstration. Thousands of students proved it works through their own healings and transformations. Now it is your turn to prove it. Not by believing these words, but by testing the principle in your own consciousness and watching what happens in your experience. Bind truth today. Unbind limitation today. Practice consistently through challenges and doubts. Watch for demonstrations. Learn from setbacks. Refine your understanding. Keep binding truth until it becomes your permanent consciousness. This is the path Goldsmith walked. This is the path he invites you to walk. What you bind in consciousness today determines what you experience tomorrow. Bind wisely. Bind truth. Bind heaven. And watch heaven become your earthly reality. If this complete teaching has transformed your understanding of spiritual power, like this video so others can discover these life-changing principles, subscribe for more profound Joel Goldsmith wisdom, and comment, "I am binding truth," to declare your commitment to this practice right now.